Today we're going to paint a rainy street full of vibrant reflections. I will be exclusively using the new 5-piece cruelty-free brush set, which you can find in the video description. We'll be painting a lot of very sharp detail on our very tiny canvas, so the fan brush as well as the liner should really aid you in that process. The flats will also just be great for establishing structure. That said, the traceable will be up over on Patreon if you'd like help with the drawing process. And you can also find the ebooks up there, which include acrylics for beginners, as well as a bunch of other traceables. With that, let's jump in and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I will dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will just help keep the paint wet for a little bit longer. With that, we're going to begin by grabbing quite an abundance of our titanium white. The smallest amount of Mars Black, I'm just going to use the corner of my brush, and I'm going to take off the excess. Then we'll also grab about double that in our Cerulean blue. What we're looking for here is a nice desaturated but bright blue sky, just like that. And you want to mix it quite well so that you don't have some areas that are going to be a little more dark, light, blue, saturated, desaturated. We want it to be consistent. And then, using this brush, we're just going to block in that open area of sky. And to avoid brush strokes, we're just going to go over it once horizontally with as little pressure as possible, and this is just going to take out any of the streaks. Now we're going to slowly work our way forwards and begin with this building right here. It's going to be slightly darker and slightly more gray than what we currently have as our mix, but it will really blend into that background because of all of that shared atmospheric light. So we'll just interject some Mars Black into our mixture. I'm going to use that nice sharp edge of the brush to cut along the side of the building. And you can see that I'm making multiple applications rather than a singular one, very intentionally, because when you make larger singular strokes, typically you have an arc and you don't actually get a longer straight line. So just work that on. Now here we can fill it in, make sure that it's nice and thick. And if it isn't, we will go back and add a second or third layer, just because it will make it look a lot more professional. That said, we're going to get a little bit darker as you move towards the right yet again, but I do need more paint, so we will remix with the titanium white, the cerulean. And again, the goal is to make it all feel nice and cohesive. Here it is, slightly darker, cutting along the building that we have right in front of it. We can even work this down to the bottom, do a little blend up. And now the top of the building is brighter, the bottom of the building is a little bit darker, and then the side of it is definitively darker. So we have depth in a couple of different ways. Now, in the reference photo, this area right here is actually open sky, but I'm going to make it building, just so we have a bit more of a vignette effect. It's an artistic liberty, but it's one I think that will make the painting look better in the end. Now, something I do want to do is brighten this up just a little bit. So we're going to interject more of that titanium white, more of that cerulean blue, titanium white, and this just goes to show you that just because you've applied paint once doesn't mean it's stuck that way. We can go back, we can edit, we can make these changes. That's one of the beautiful things about acrylic paints. They're just so malleable. That's why you don't have to be afraid to jump into it, start trying things. There we go. just softened it a little bit, but using very minimal amounts of pressure. That way it looks a little bit farther away. Now I'm going to switch to the smaller flat-headed brush in the set, and we're going to render a bit of a darker yet slightly more blue variant of the color that we have here. So adding in some extra Mars Black and Cerulean Blue, this is what we're going to use for blocking in the windows. So I'm going to go to my vanishing point because I've drawn over my sketch. I'm going to come over here, and I know that there will be a window there, window there, there. They're all segmented to be about the same distance apart. And by continuously going back to this, working our way up, we ensure that we have the correct perspective. Because we're essentially painting with a 1-point perspective piece here, which keeps it nice and easy. And we'll just continue that to the top. We don't want too much detail in these backing buildings because we don't want to make it distracting to the point where it takes away from the foreground. And when you do cityscapes and things of this nature, that is something you need to consider, especially when working on such a small canvas, very purposefully simplifying different elements. Here I just need a little bit less water on my brush, and I'm just going to tap on the edges to all of these, create that slight separation, like so. And then we also have just a line going down here. Like that. And of course we have windows running through the back. But instead of painting the individual windows in, I'm just going to make a slightly brighter variant of the actual area of the building there. Potentially like this. Nope, that is too dark. Trial and error. Closer. We can also test directly on the reference photo to make it really easy, but I do just like color mixing, practicing, and asking myself the process of, is it too bright? Is it too dark? Is it too saturated? Is it not saturated enough? Going back between those until we have the right answer, because that's all color mixing really is. So that series of questions over and over again. Once you can get it, color mixing will forever be a whole lot easier. Also going to do a little bit of separation in there. Just like this. Little markings for all of the potential windows. They're not perfect because they're farther away. We don't need that much detail. It can even look a little impressionistic if you want. And I might even take a little bit of this and just calm the darker pigments that we used to edge the windows. There we go. Now we're going to get a little closer and work on a couple of buildings right back here. They'll be covered by trees for the most part, but we do want the hint of them. Now the first one is quite gray, so I'm going to continue working in my bluish gray mix over here, this time emphasizing more Mars Black over anything and trying to dilute the blue to a great degree. With that, I'm just looking over on my reference photo. You could redraw it in, but I don't think I need to. It's going to go right here. I'm going to start by drawing in the sides, a connective top, and then we're going to have a pointed roof. Once I have my edging done, I fill it in, and that's a typical rule I have. because when you have fresh paint and a damp brush, you have the best opportunity to render your sharpest markings, and the more you use that pigment and that brush, the harder it becomes. So we start with the more difficult things like the edging, where you need exact strokes, and then we start working on everything else. This is not perfect yet, but we can continue just fixing it up a little bit. Make it a little wider as we move down. And I can also see a little bit of almost a railing or a little piece in there, which we don't need to fully elaborate on, but we can do a hint. And a little piece on the top. There we go. Not complex, but unique enough that it feels legitimate. I also want there to be a brighter spot in the middle, as is in the reference photo. So yet again, I'm going in towards that center. This time, brighter pigment. And remember, the pigment you apply now here won't be what you have on your palette. It will be an amalgamation of what's on the palette and what's already on the painting, because it will blend. It is still wet. And even if it wasn't, acrylics are semi-transparent, and that means that we will see the under pigment as well. That said, nice little building there. We might go back and do a second layer just to thicken it up, but for now I want to let it dry. And in the meantime, we're going to grab some of our cadmium red and equal parts burnt sienna, titanium white, because we're going to need to desaturate this dramatically, and Mars black because we want it to be darker. So we're looking for a very desaturated, darker, nice red brick color. And the burnt sienna will make it slightly more earthy, which is nice. So we're not just working with a pure cadmium red. And that will go right here and work its way down. Has a bit of a rounded top to it, which is nice and unique. And I think we can actually blend it into the background a little bit better by just interjecting more titanium white, because it's quite stark at this point. And while it's closer to us, we do want room to grow with those values. There we go. That's definitely better. We also have another red building to the right, and we're going to make it slightly more saturated because it's closer to us. We're getting less of that reflective light. It's not going to be too noticeably red, but it will be more so. There we go. You can tell just how thin this is though, because you can see the canvas showing through it, and that illustrates the need for either more layers or more thick pigment in the mix. And titanium white and Mars black are thicker than cadmium red, so by doing this we desaturate it, but that's not something I actually have an issue with at all. There we go. We can work that down here. Again, we'll have trees covering a lot of it, but it's okay. We'll also make a darker variant to go towards the back. Same building. There's going to be another building right here, so we're just dodging that. We'll do a softer blend between these two, just a little bit. Doesn't need to all be extremely hard lines. I'm just doing that with a soft application. You can see this is a little bit diagonal. I'm painting on an angle because the camera is where typically I would like to be. So ensuring that it's all perfectly straight is something I kind of have to do off camera a little bit. But hopefully you get the idea here. Now we're going to briefly head over to this side of the painting and take some of these colors, move them over. That way we have a balance within the painting and everything feels nice and cohesive. Also, again, a lot of this is going to get covered, so while it might not be the most attractive pigment with the blues, it's not going to be a larger piece of it, and long term it will just act as a nice little contrast. So with that, trying to keep my hand out of the way for you, we're just going to work on the edge of this building, which is facing the street. Because it is facing the street, it's going to receive a good amount of light as the light works its way through here. That's why this side of the building is bright and this one is dark. Street facing is going to be adopting more of that brightness. So we're just going to fill this in. Again, because of the angle I'm painting on, I can't tell right now if it's fully straight, but if not, I will go back and fix it after. I'm also going to work a little bit of this down here. And we'll make it darker for the side that is not street facing. Just interjecting some extra Mars black. It's kind of similar to what we have on the other side. Quite similar, actually. Do the edges first, block in the rest. There's mostly a tree to the bottom, but the more of this we paint, the more openings in the tree we can create. I'm also going to take this same dark pigment, block in this bottom area, and just have it transition into that brighter pigment. This is going to have a lot covering it, and I almost just want a passage of light rather than any specific detail. That looks fairly good though. Let's go for a slightly brighter variant. This time interjecting a little bit of our cadmium yellow deep hue. And we need to ensure that we have a decent red base, because if we don't, the yellow and the Mars black in the mix will simply turn into a green. So we need more red than we do black. And then for this, we're going to just make the top and the bottom of what we are currently working on a little bit more interesting. Some of those unique details that will make the buildings stand out from each other while not looking disconnected from one another. So we have similar pigments, but this side definitely has a unique building. Now, while we wait for that to dry, this should be dry, and that means we can start working over here again. There's a bit of an overhang that's quite interesting in this, and there are some pieces that wrap around this more circular area. So we're going to start with the overhang. I'm going to grab some of our Mars black, hint of each red, but not much, a little bit of titanium white. This is likely going to be the darkest pigment we've worked with yet. And for it, we're essentially going to start here. It's going to find that vanishing line. Again, we could redraw it, but we don't have to if we know what we're doing. There we go. Also, again, as noted at the start of the video, if you would like help with the drawing process, the traceable reference photo access to our exclusive Facebook group. All of the ebooks are up over on Patreon, and they are linked in the description. And they are just to make your job a little bit easier when working on these things. Now I'm going for a brighter mix. This time I'm not going to use any of the cadmium red, but I do want it to be desaturated, so we're going back and forth between the titanium white, the Mars black, and then for a little bit of hue, we have the burnt sienna. There we are. We'll work on the top of this. Blend it down. I'm trying to avoid that darker overhang until I absolutely have to touch it because I don't want to dilute the current pigment with it to a great degree. There we go. We're not done though. We're going to grab more of that pigment and we're going to paint in a couple of columns holding it up. Just like so. We're going to brighten the side of the column that's closest to the street because it will be a bit brighter. So interjecting that titanium white. I'm also going to take that same pigment, maybe a slightly more titanium white, work that on the part of the overhang that is facing the street, not just the columns. Might paint it a little bit more loosely. Again, I wouldn't be mad if I ended up with more of an impressionistic look in this piece. That's something we can add later or we can build into it now, but I do like the idea of having a bit more of a loose cityscape. Now, we're going to start working a couple little details into here and in here and right there. A lot of details, but we are getting closer to us and that means we can incorporate more, right? So with this, I'm going to start with the windows of our building and we'll begin with a bit of a darker mixture than what we had, not substantially. Doesn't need to be as dark as this, but certainly darker. And then this brush is perfect for it. I'm just going to try to find an angle. We'll run down windows in sets of 2. Just like that. Just takes a little bit of a stroke thanks to the sharp edges of this brush. It's nice and easy. I also want to use this pigment to do a little bit of a wraparound effect for this back building. Makes it a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more interesting. I also want a little bit of a top almost gate-like look for a couple of these areas. You can see just how small this marking is because we have a damp brush and it's just really well made. Nice and easy. We can have another one wrapping around the back of the more circular building. And we can even include the hint of a window or door right there. Nothing too dramatic. You can also take this slightly darker pigment and just tap it into the windows, create a little bit more variance. We can use it to create additional depth on the back of these columns if we'd like to. Again, there's a lot of option in here. It's not in the reference photo, but I also want to take some of this darker mixture and create a slight separation in between the two different hues that we used for this. I think it'll just look nice and interesting. Again, it's okay to take artistic liberties here and there. I think that's all we need to do in that area. Great. So, now we are going to continue to proceed working on our buildings. And I think, I'm just going to look at my reference photo. have a couple printed out up there. I have it on my phone down at the bottom. That way I can just zoom in if I need to, but I can also paint directly on the reference photos. So there's just a lot of option. And with that, the next step is working on the buildings to the left. So for them, they're larger. I'm going to put this brush down. I'm going to pick up the 1-inch flat. Make sure it's nice and damp as we like it. We're going to go for a bit more of a gray. So titanium white, Mars black. And it will be a mid to dark gray, similar to what we've just rendered right here. We do need a little bit of hue in it, and I'm actually going to go with the Cerulean blue rather than these. We don't need a warm brick. This is more of a gray building that has blue in it because of all of the surrounding reflective light. So we'll take this as our first pass. What do? We cut along the edges first. The 1-inch flat is fantastic for it because we have a lot of pigment on there. It can pick up a lot, it can move around a lot, but it does have those nice sharp edges for detail. We have another overhang right here, which I'll cut around. And then we have the drawing of a tree, which we can paint back in after. And we're just going to fill in this area. There we go. Make my brush a little bit more damp. Go back to the palette, grab more pigment, head down under the overhang. Get those drawings in. We have a little subject in front of it, which we will dodge. Fill this in. But now, we're going to make this a bit more three-dimensional. Grab a hint of Mars black, not much. And you know what? That was a little bit more than I wanted, so we're going to re-interject the titanium white and Mars black. And that's much better. I'm going to make the left-hand side a little bit darker because it's farther away from the light. We'll do a soft blend in towards the middle. Let's do it again. Slowly interjecting that darker pigment. Slightly more gray. I'm blending it very softly. Everything is still wet because the brush was damp initially. And this will give us a nice little vignette effect. Starting to dry, so I need to be careful. This will probably be my last pass here unless I want to go back in and reincorporate the brighter pigments as well, which isn't a bad option. But I think I'm actually quite happy with what we have. So, now that that's in place, there are some really unique windows in here, but to the point where I feel like they might be too distracting. So I'm going to simplify what we have in here. Yet again, putting down the 1-inch flat, picking up the smaller flat, making sure it is nice and damp. We'll kind of come up with our own little window scheme here, going with something darker than what we've previously worked with, but it's still not a pure black. Again, this brush is amazing for windows because we can just cut along so simply. Create nice pattern, repetition. And again, hopefully this goes to show you that using a reference photo is fantastic because it opens your ideas in your mind up to things that you wouldn't inherently think to incorporate, and therefore it's going to make it look a lot more realistic, right? Because when we imagine something in our heads, typically it's tied to an initial idea of what that subject is, and that idea is formed when we are younger, when we're watching cartoons and looking at little storybooks. So we have these simplified ideas of what subjects are. By looking at a reference photo, we expand that knowledge. We incorporate minute details that we wouldn't innately think to incorporate. But the trap in that is that we feel like we have to make it look exactly like the reference photo to make it look real or great. And that's not the case. You can interject pieces of yourself to make it unique, to make it you. And it is not incorrect if you decide to deviate from that. The same goes for these lessons. I'm here to help you, I'm here to teach you, I'm here to guide you, but I'm not here to tell you exactly what to do 100% of the time, because it's art and it's objective and you're making your art, and it's okay if your art is different than my art. In fact, that's great. So, point being, don't feel constrained by the media that you are inspired by, but do recognize that it is an aid, and that typically it's the balance that will render the best pieces. I'm going to do a little line across the top, give it a little overhang, just like that. These aren't all perfectly straight. Again, I'm okay with that. You could make them perfectly straight if you did not have a camera in front of you and you spent a little bit more time. But again, I like painting cityscapes that are a little bit more loose. I just feel like it's more about capturing the energy and the life of the cityscape than it is all of the minute details. Though we do want enough minute details that it feels natural, right? That we do capture the essence. And that's really what I'm trying to do here. There we go. Now we do have that overhang. Bottom part should be quite dark. A little bit of blue, hint of titanium white, but not much. Mostly Mars black. Cutting along the edges first. This brush feels just like drawing, and I love it. Fill it in. Get a nice thick application so we don't have to do it twice. Now we'll go for a brighter variant for the top ledge of it. Might blend into the previous top of the building, and that's okay. You would assume that they are painted the same way. And we can do a couple little columns. Just like so. This one will be a lot bigger because it's closer to us. That one's smaller, it's farther away. We'll need a darker backing for both of them. And then we can blend them together. We're also going to be putting lights underneath it. And I can tell from the viewfinder, not from my canvas, that this has quite an angle. So I will fix that, but I do need to move the camera, fix my proportions. Again, that's why using a traceable and actually sketching it out is good, but also painting it from a proper angle. I'm going to fix that, and then we'll move on to the next step together. So I went ahead and fixed all of the perspective in there. I think it looks a lot cleaner, but again, having it look a bit more loose, not a bad thing. That said, this area down here definitely needs to be quite a bit darker because we do have this overhang, and that is going to heavily impact the amount of light that can kind of come through there. So while it's brighter on top, that makes sense, it doesn't towards the bottom. So I'm going to grab some of our Mars black, cerulean blue, titanium white, make a slightly darker mixture than what we had. And that is quite dark. You know what? Actually, I'm going to use this to reinforce the overhang itself. Just like that. Because we did need to do a second layer. And then I'll go with something a little bit brighter for the underside. Again, still using a decent amount of blue. And that's definitely better. It can still progressively get brighter as we move towards the right, progressively get darker as we move towards the left. So we'll just grab some extra titanium white, blue, titanium white. Work that into this edge. And then blend it back. Nice and easy. That said, we also want some details for doors and other little things like that. So I'm heading back to the smaller flat-headed brush. We are going to go back to the darker variant of this mixture, something quite similar to the overhang itself. And I think we'll just incorporate a line right here, a little bit to the left of this structure, another one over here. Maybe we put a line down the center for that of a door. It's all quite dark, so it's small details at this point. We can also take a little bit more of that dark pigment and just blend it over on the left-hand side as we move towards the right. Just make it all feel a bit more cohesive. We can add windows, but I'm a little hesitant to do that right now because I haven't placed any other lights within this, and the windows would have light. So we'd essentially be starting to incorporate a much brighter value than what we've been working with, and I don't want to do that until we can establish it in other areas and create proper balance. So we're not going to do that right now. Instead, we're going to actually move down a little bit with the larger flat-headed brush and start working on the street to a point. I'm going to begin with that darker mixture, and we'll do that for the very back of the street, just like so. Start to move that forward, and then we'll make it a little bit brighter. And by a little bit, I do mean a little bit. We're not going to take grand steps. There are different things on the street which we will reincorporate. We'll do a little blend into this darker area. Definitely need more darker pigment. It's darker under the overhang, gets brighter as you move out towards the street. Now we need more of that gray and white. Notice how my stroke is expanding as we get closer this way. It's very intentional because of perspective. There we go. A little overhang to it, but we'll make that much more orange. I just want a bit of a base. There we go. Now we are going to have some darker, essentially grates and things of that nature. One of them is going to come out from here. Just like that. Looking for horizontal markings on the top and bottom, and then one that follows the through line of the street itself. And if we want, we can place little openings into it. Don't have to, but we are on the foreground, so if we're going to incorporate a lot of detail anywhere, it is here. So just slightly brighter. Nothing too dramatic there. Going to create another slightly darker area right here. Nice and easy. We're going to have subjects like trees and a little trash can. We can do the trash can now. Going back to the smaller brush, and we are going to be using other brushes. It's just that a lot of this is most easily done with what we already have out. That said, there will be use for the fan brush, the filbert, and the liner fairly soon. Here we have that little trash can. Nice and simple. Not too dramatic. Just cleaning off my brush a little bit. Okay, so let's start establishing this side of the road using that same pigment. This is all essentially going to be covered by cars, which is interesting. Just taking a second to really think about it. There we go. And this essentially needs to go back and up until we have a connection with that to a point. Make it brighter when it's farther away. And I'll just have it get darker as it gets towards the foreground. Less of that reflective light that we've talked about. I'm going to be adding a lot of foliage in here. I might also take a little bit more of this bright pigment and just work that on here to a point. Might even try to make it look a little bit scratchy. So not going for the cleanest blends or applications, just because it's concrete, it's wet concrete, doesn't need to be perfect. Now over here, we're going to reincorporate our reds a little bit, and I'm going 50-50 with the burnt sienna and the cadmium red deep hue. We're going for a bit of a darker mixture though. It's on the edge, we're farther away from the light than we are with the other buildings, so while we are using both the reds and the titanium white, we are going to go a lot heavier into the Mars black. We can build this up in brightness should we want to, but we're just going to start over here by working on this nice little structure, using the corner of the brush to deliver the details. And as you can see, this is quite a thin application because both of the reds are thin pigments and we have a lot of them, as opposed to titanium white, because we can't use that much titanium white because we don't want it to be too bright. However, if we're willing to sacrifice saturation, which I am, we can double up on the titanium white and the Mars black, create something quite a bit thicker, and here, now you can't really see the canvas showing through. Had we gone in with the same color again, you would. This isn't just because we have more paint. Sometimes the actual thickness of the paint has a really big impact, and this is one of those scenarios. There we go. You know what, I'm actually going to cover the entirety of the bottom of it, and then we're going to create an opening later with a different brush, just for simplicity's sake. But quite a dark red initially. We'll make a slightly brighter variant of it to create that light that works from the right hand side to the left, as we've established with other buildings. It's not dramatic, but it does look quite nice. Now I'm going to switch to the smaller flat-headed brush. There we go. Just a little bit of depth. Now, as we move up, we're going to get into more of a glass, and that is going to reflect the colors of the sky. So we're going back to a bit of a bluish gray, darker value for the base, and we can build on it. Just like that. making nice sharp edges. We're going to have a little sign between the two of them. That'll be done in like a almost very light gray. Hint of blue there though. And we could add text to this, but I think it would probably just look messy. So we're going to opt not to. And now we'll blend the two of them and just create some very intentional streaks down the glass. It's a rainy day, and we just want to show that. So we're looking for something kind of messy. Then we're going to have a little overhang. Lots of those in this painting. That will go right above. Definitely needs to be darker. And I'm just going to make sure that I'm following my perspective line. Looks good. We're also going to have one that goes down the right-hand side. Add in a couple little details. Go back up to the top. We're going to make it extremely bright. Relatively to everything else, it's not actually going to be extremely bright, but it's important to consider the context of the area that it's in. And this is just a metal that's significantly more reflective. Getting that light from the sky, we can even take a little bit of it and work it into that window area. Little taps here and there. Make it cohesive by just working a little bit of that highlight into the street. That said, I also wanted to create a bit more detail in that top piece. So we're just going to, using this smaller flat, create some of these directional lines. They act as leading lines, they point us in, they look nice. But we're also going to open up this bottom area. Like it is a little bit more in the reference photo. There we go. It's very unique looking. I like it a lot. You can see them consistently taking pigments from other areas and reincorporating them elsewhere. It's very intentional. That way things end up being nice and cohesive. Now it's finally time to head back over here. You can see that there's still some open canvas. A lot of this is going to be covered by trees, but I do want this bottom area to be complete enough for me to leave openings should I want them in the foliage and not feel constrained to cover all of it. So what I'm going to do is, again, I've been apprehensive about adding a lot of little windows because they have light typically and I don't want to instigate that before we should, but we're going to do a little bit of it. I'm going to take burnt sienna, titanium white, Mars black. We're going to create a bit of a darker warm hue. And we'll make that a little opening, a little opening. Just looking at the photo, we could do more right here. Let's change it though. Let's add a little bit of our cadmium yellow deep hue. Make sure that it doesn't mix with any of our yellow or any of our blue, because then it would be a green. We'll just run this across here. Do little taps of light in here. Not too much. We'll go back to the reddish base. Fill that into a greater degree. both on the bottom and on the top. Create some little breaks in the windows. This is just going to make our life a little bit easier. And it really doesn't have to be perfect. This is where you can kind of take more of those artistic liberties and just kind of have fun with it. No stress, time, or zone right here. I'm going to make this back half of the building a little bit darker, as we tend to do. Toning these down slightly. A little bit more light on the top there. But I think I'm going to connect these again. There we go. Okay, that will be great to cover up. And if we want to brighten portions of it later, we can do that very easily. So, quite happy with that. Next, we are going to do something that not everybody has to do, not everybody will want to do, but I do, and I think it can be quite helpful for a lot of you. So what we're going to do is we're going to clean our brush extremely well, make sure that the water that you're cleaning it in isn't dirty, and you know what? I'm going to go clean my water. I'm going to clean my brush well, and then we're going to come back, because it will make an impact. So we are back, brush entirely clean, water dish entirely clean. We're going to take a little bit of our titanium white, and again, you don't have to do this. I'd recommend watching me do it first before you endeavor into it. I'm going to take a little bit of our Cerulean blue, move those to a clean spot on the palette, go back, grab water, and make it into essentially a watercolor. We're just going to do a little glaze. Might grab a little bit more titanium white. Going to throw this over on the back sky, and then work it over the far buildings to a small degree. This is just going to give everything a little bit more depth, make it all feel like it's sitting in the back and then moving forward. It's going to soften some of the reds that we have. And I'm letting it dissipate as we get closer to the foreground because it is brighter, it has a lot of titanium white, and I don't want it to necessarily dilute or make these areas a lot brighter. Slowly just taking a little bit more of that titanium white, working it in, especially doing it with this building right here and then this little one in the back. We don't want it too much in the foreground, but it's a rainy day so we can get away with it. And I'm even brightening up the background at this point, just a little bit. There we go, that's what I really wanted. Took a couple of applications, but we got there. Now you can see just how subtle the transition of buildings is. I think that made a really nice big difference on a rainy day. Again, you don't have to do it. And I would recommend trying a glaze if you haven't before on a canvas you don't like, because it can take a little bit of practice. But as you can see, it can create quite a nice impact. That said, I'm going to take this brush, put it down. We're going to grab, for the first time, Sap Green, also Winsor & Newton. Add a little bit of that to my palette because it is time to have fun with the trees. For the trees, for the bodies, for the most part, I'm going to switch to the Filbert. This is great because it has rounded corners, so I can get softer applications if I want, but it has a nice sharp top and edge, so I can also get details. Incredibly versatile brush, great for foliage in the midground and foreground. So we'll grab some of this sap green. We're going to need to make a nice darker mix initially here. Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. We do want it to be a gray green because we have very gray reds and we have very gray blues. Just going back and forth. Again, you can test it on the reference photo or work a bit more intuitively. We have a lot of trees in the background here, which I'm just going to tap the implication of on. This is quite thin, as you can probably see. So we will have to do multiple layers with it, but that's okay. And as we get closer to us on both the right and the left-hand side, these trees are going to expand, they're going to get bigger. You can see that I'm rotating my brush as I paint in the air, not on the actual canvas, because I don't want to drag the paint. I just want to change each individual marking that I'm making on the canvas so that it's always unique and interesting. I'm also leaving little openings, as you can see, showing portions of that building coming through. There we go. And we're going to have a lot of it over here. But as we move closer to us, as we're doing right here, we're getting farther away from that light in the background. So we're going to take more of our Mars black and work that in. Make it a bit darker. Going back in with all of those taps and rotations till we get something that's a good transition. Love that. There we go. We're going to need trees over here to the left-hand side. And this one's closer to us, so we can actually go in with the darker pigment. You can see it slightly covers that. And it goes quite high. It's essentially close to right behind this car. Then we progressively work our way there. Leave little openings. Just looking back up at the reference photo. I'm not going to cover all of the detail in these buildings, but it is okay to cover some of it. There we go. Thicken some portions, more so close to the bottom. I don't want to do too many close to the top because I like how semi-transparent it is, and it makes it look like there's a real fade of light occurring. I'm also going to make this softer application around a lot of the edges of green in the background so that they do just look like they're fading into that rainy sky. Soft and subtle. I like it. Now, we need to incorporate a brand new tree right here for us to have foliage. So yet again, new brush. We are switching to the liner. Fantastic for real sharp detail work. We're going to grab some of our Mars black, a little bit of our Cerulean blue, just like that. Hint of our titanium white, but we're quite close to the foreground now, so we can go with very extreme values. And that will come down to right about here. We'll paint in a little planter that we can expand on in a little bit. And this will essentially give context to where all of these trees are, right? We can also add in their bases. Should get smaller as you move into the distance. With all trees, typically, your marks should get larger as they work their way down. Start small at the top. I like to start my strokes for the most part at the top and then work my way down, slowly applying more pressure. And I do that very intentionally because, again, when we go in initially with fresh pigment and water, we can render those sharp markings so much easier. And if you start with them and you just accept that over time it will get harder, you plan for it. So as it gets harder, and I know that I'm going to have to create a larger marking, I get to an area in the painting that's going to need a larger marking, right? So, nice and easy right there. We could apply the greenery with this brush, but I really like doing so with the filbert. We can touch it up with that brush should we want to, but for now, going back to that sap green, that filbert, Mars black, hint of titanium white, but this is predominantly a Mars black and sap green mix. And then this I'm pressing as little as I possibly can, so I just get that nice sharp tip to render all of these unique pieces of foliage within our tree. We are covering up a good amount of the building. That's okay. Again, don't fear covering up previous work even if you really like it. That is something, a hurdle, that a lot of new painters typically have. But the paintings often look so much better when you are willing to move forward with it. Continue evolving the painting and adding in the way that we are. See, we covered almost all of the windows, which is why I wasn't too worried about the perspective, but I did want to fix it just for the few that we would end up seeing. I'm going to grab a little bit more Mars black. Deepen the shadows in the larger portions of the clusters that light can't pass through. So that's typically going to be on the left-hand side of each little cluster. A little bit more over here, creating a nice vignette effect in the painting. Just expanding our tree slightly. Not too great amounts, but that looks great. Looks really nice. Now we're going to head back over to the right-hand side, balance it. Mars black, sap green. And this tree is going to be a bit closer to us. We just don't see the body of it. So it'll overlap these trees. We'll have slight openings. Just like that. Not too dramatic. We can also put that brush down, switch to the liner, which I just dropped. Grab some of that darker pigment, green and the Mars black, and we can paint in individual little leaves. Give us the best control possible. Again, I really like the natural formations that we can get with the filbert, but I think it's a combination of the two that are going to give us the best results here. There we go. A little bit more. Brilliant. Big fan. Now we get to engage with what I think a lot of us seek out these paintings for, and that is a road. There's something so cathartic, so fun, so fulfilling about painting a wet street, and that is very luckily our next step. I'm excited for it. So I'm going back to the larger flat-headed brush because we have a lot of surface area to cover here. And I'm going to begin by working on the blues that work through here, because we already have a lot of blues and it will feel like a natural cohesive way to start, where if we started with the oranges that exist over here, it might feel a little jarring. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by grabbing some of our titanium white, about half that in our cerulean blue, hint of our Mars black, really not much, and we'll start placing this at the back of our street. We can line the edge of our sidewalk a little bit, and then I'm going to bring it down. You have this little separation in the middle of the road. That's what I'm looking at as a divider right now, essentially. And with this, we're going to have it move out essentially in the same axes from this one-ish point perspective. Now this is very watery. First couple of layers for the street will be, just so that I have a lot of room to play, but we will solidify it with more intentional thick layers as we proceed. So you can see that we have essentially this larger block, we have a second area, and then we're going to have a third which will follow some of the lines of the road, and then we have the what's left over essentially. We're going to make a darker mixture, equal parts cerulean blue, Mars black, hint of titanium white, and we'll use this for the darker part of the road initially, filling in the remaining white of the canvas, with the exception of this little area right here, which is essentially just going to be a little painted on line on the road. Definitely need more pigment. Typically you also won't see me scraping the brush against the canvas like I am right now, but because we're just working intentionally in thin layers, it's okay here, but it's not what you want in a finished layer or area. And then we're looking to get a little bit of a blend into that previous application. It's okay if it's a little messy right now. Just like that. Just trying to get a feel for it. Go back to that brighter pigment. A lot of titanium white, a little bit of that cerulean blue. More titanium white. Work that forward. Recreate some of those markings that we lost in the dark. Do a little bit of a blend into the last application. Go back to the dark pigment, and this is really about working back and forth till we get what we really want. We're not settling. We are going to continue applying, going back and forth until we have a nice wet looking street. I want a bit more of a transition between the two pigments. And a lot of those transitions I like to do with a little bit of a horizontal stroke, as you've been noticing. We start with these elongated ones that follow the line work of the street, and then I deviate into horizontal ones. And I do this because a lot of that water is going to reflect horizontally, and there are going to be horizontal divots in the road, and I want to visually incorporate those as well. So we're not just going with brush strokes that are diagonal or horizontal, we're doing both. Back and forth. Let's continue making that corner a little bit darker. I like how this little area is starting to pop out. Again, going back to that corner, making it darker. I also want to make this line that's not in the center of the street, more so kind of having shadow from the trees to be darker. There we go. I'm leaving in brush strokes intentionally, so it looks like little divots in the road. Makes it a bit more visually unique. Now I do want a bit more of a soft transition between this and this, but both of them have started to dry, so I'm actually just going to grab a bit of that lighter pigment, a little bit of that darker pigment, mix them together, find a middle ground. Just like that. Do a little finger painting. Never too old for finger painting. There we go. Getting a little bit quiet because I'm just in the process of thinking about it while I paint it. A lot of this is trial and error. Create some extra little divots in the road. I like that a lot. And at this point, I think it's something we come back to. There definitely needs to be more in this, but I don't want to overdo it before I do this side of the road. So I think we'll pull the camera back, we'll work on this, we'll connect them, and then we'll add to this greatly. Now, this side of the road, I'm going to approach a bit more differently. I don't want to begin with the actual orange pigment. I'm going to start with more of a gray and slowly work our way to the orange. But I know that I want this back corner to be a bit more of that same dark blue that we have over here, so it's nice and cohesive. So I'm actually going to begin with that right here. Work that to a great degree back and towards the light. We're also going to have a bit of this dark pigment in the road separating the two sides of the road. And there are some little divots, unique pieces in there. We also have lots of unique little areas that sink in. So I'm just going to use this brush in a somewhat abstract manner to articulate those. There we go. This one actually goes all the way across, which is nice. Kind of acts as a bit of a connective tissue between the two. Now let's make it a bit more gray. Getting a little bit of a soft blend into the side there. See that I'm keeping my brush fairly horizontal for a lot of this application. I'm going to be dodging that car right there. If we go over a lot of those darker markings, it's okay. They're very easy to reincorporate. Let's make this brighter as we work towards the back. I know it's looking very messy. That's okay. Don't be discouraged if yours does as well. It's just part of the process. Let's make the back a bit more of a blue. Needs to go through the awkward phase to get to what we know is very accomplishable. It's just working with acrylic paintings. We're just going to work some of the gray over to the other side, some of the blue over on this side, predominantly towards the center area. Little taps horizontally, letting it dissipate as we get towards the left-hand side. And this is one of the primary reasons I didn't want to finish this side, because I knew we'd be impacting it. To at least a small degree, but this will definitely be larger than a small degree. Take some of those pigments. There we go. Trying to keep my hand out of the way. Apologies if I'm not perfect with it. With these smaller paintings, it is a bit more of a task. Letting it be a little granular, a little grainy. You can see the tooth of the canvas. Very intentionally so. Looks like the water is creating all of these little impressions in the street. There we go. Okay, so I moved the camera just a little bit so that my hand would likely be in the way less. And I'm just going to incorporate a bit more blue over on this side. A little bit of a tap and drag through there. We can do it on the other side to a point as well. Building this area up, I like that. But as we continue to work it, our mix is going to get more gray because we're continuously working into darker areas. So we have to continuously, should we want bright pigments, go back to our palette and mix up more titanium white and cerulean blue in the mix so that we can further establish pigments like that. And again, a little hint of these highlights throughout is not a bad thing. That said, I do want to work on this area, and it is quite a bit of a warmer area. So I'm going to take the majority of that pigment off of my brush, and for this we're going to have a lot of warm reflection. I want to use the filbert brush actually for the first pass. So I'm going to grab some of our cadmium yellow deep hue, some of our cadmium red. I'd say about an equal mixture, but I think we should probably go with slightly more of the cad yellow. We're going to want to desaturate it quite abundantly. So a lot of titanium white, which will brighten it. Let's darken it with the burnt sienna. And I like darkening it with the burnt sienna because it makes it a little bit more earthy, but it also doesn't risk us going into a green in the same way Mars Black does. And we're just trying to dilute this pigment to have less and less yellow so that we can incorporate slightly more Mars Black. We're going in with the smallest amount possible. And we'll just slowly add to it. We don't want the brightest orange. We want something we can build on. And I think that's quite nice. So, we're going to have it around this car. Going back Doing a lot of horizontal markings. Really, this whole area has a lot of orange to it. And I will be notably working over previous areas of our sketch. That's okay, we can reincorporate them. I'm also essentially doing a lot of dry brushing here. The brush has next to no water on it, and that's very intentional, because this would be an incredibly thin pigment with water, and I do want that scratchy, toothy look that we can accomplish with a dry brush. I'm really building up the center of this. You can do a little bit more back here. This will go to the foreground. This will be brightened in some areas. You can see it's touching a lot of the blue to the right hand side. There we are. Good first layer. I'm going to take off the excess pigment and I'll make it brighter. More titanium white, but we can also add more yellow to it. Hint more of the cad red. We can move away from the burnt sienna in the mix. Taking the majority of the pigment off my brush. Finding where the wheels are going to be. Working that to the left and right. That said, I started doing this before all the other layers had a chance to dry, and because of that, I'm ripping up a little bit of paint that I don't want to. So we should probably wait for this to dry just a little bit before we really apply a lot, but I'm just going to soften my edges before I put this down, because I don't want it to dry with really hard edges. I want there to be a bit more of a transition. So I'm just making this softer. And then I will be patient, put the brush down, and then we'll come back to it in probably 3, maybe 4 minutes. So we've given it quite a few minutes. It has now fully dried, and that means we can go back to our pigment if it's still wet. Grab that, and yet again begin to work in that middle area where there will be light, and you can see that it's applying much better now than it was previously. Blending the softer edges with the use of the filbert, just that nice round corner, helping me to ensure that all of these markings aren't hyper sharp, but we can use the front of the brush if we do want a portion to be so. So nice and versatile. I'm also going to use the remainder of the pigment on the brush once it's almost run out to just do a little bit of a soft scrape over the rest of the orange, predominantly in horizontal strokes. And this will just give us a nice watery look to the road. There we go. Let's make it more desaturated, a little bit more yellow. This time, you know what, I think I'm going to go in with the burnt sienna just to get something a little more muted, because the cad yellow deep hue and the red will make a much more vibrant orange. And as we get towards the center of this light, I want it to be much more desaturated. And we can't really desaturate yellow with Mars Black because of the greens. So this is a great way of going about it. There we go. Again, a lot to do with the road, but we are getting there slowly and steadily. Can even incorporate a little bit of that highlight onto the other side of this. I like that look a lot. And then as we're almost out of paint, again we do that soft drag. Makes it a bit more cohesive. There we are. Working quite well. Back to the titanium white. It's a lot of back and forth. You can tell that it gets a lot quicker though as we practice. We're also going to switch our brush temporarily to the 1 inch. Load that up, and we'll create the lines in the road towards the right hand side with this pigment. Typically I don't like to drag longer strokes like this, but I'm okay if it has a little bit of an arch because the road has a little bit of an arch. And we want it to get larger as we get closer to us. Now we need to do a second one right beside it. There we go. Nice and easy. Starting to balance both sides of the road with the addition of that. We'll also have street lights, little reflections. In fact, there's a little reflection I can see in the reference photo from right here. So I'll just work that in. Balances the street again nicely. Just going to take this, just do a wider application. Work that into the blue a little bit. Starting to fit together. Okay. Now, we'll put this brush down for a... You know what? No, we won't. We're going to double down on our orange because we're going to work on the curb of the street. And I want a lot of pigment, so you can see that I'm mixing with a great deal of paint here. We don't want it to be hyper saturated, so again, we do fall on that titanium white. Do a little test. And this is essentially the edge of the sidewalk catching all of this reflective light. Very good. I'm going to put that brush down for a sec. We're going to switch to the filbert. Grab that pigment. I'm going to work it onto the side of this little subject that we have. It's reflective, it's metallic. Have that light work its way there. Just looking for all of the little reflective areas that can catch that orange light. Have it around the base of the tree, just in the planter. A little bit on the garbage can. There's some beautiful light in the reflection up here of the glass. So we'll build that in. I'm also going to take this and thicken up the foreground of these applications. Not the back, I want them to be a bit more subtle. Have the blue of the road showing through, but in the foreground we can accentuate it. A little bit there too. Beautiful. Now more titanium white. And I think you know what we're doing. Always going back to these middle areas and building them up. We're working on a darker base, so the more we layer, the brighter it'll get, because we always see a little bit of that underlayer showing through, and the brighter we make that underlayer, the brighter the new layer will be. I'm also going to take a little bit of this and just add some randomized highlight to the edges of the sidewalk. A little bit on here too. Just building up that diversity minorly. And I say minorly, that might have been a little too much, to be honest. I'm going to make it slightly more uniform. There we go. This doesn't need to be as bright as the other side, but I am making it a bit brighter so that it balances well. We'll have a little bit of a reflection, actually, of this on the road. But I'm not going to do it directly under it because we're going to have a little divot. So I skip a little bit of a spot, I do it, and now I'm working it horizontally back into the road, with the top of the marking still being quite sharp. There we go. Nice little reflection. You can add that in a small degree over here. Not much though. Not like this side. Something else we can do while we have all this pigment on our brush, switch to the liner. Grab not the brightest, but some of the bright. Incorporate a couple little lights back here. Showing through the trees to a small degree. You can also have little lights back there. There's a larger street lamp in the reference photo here, but I feel like there really isn't the space to make it balanced and aesthetic in the way that I want to, so I'm not going to include that. But we can incorporate a little bit of light showing through the trees over here, especially towards the bottom, because we've pre-established the windows and the light there. Just going to build that up through a couple layers, make sure it's nice and thick. Again, things that I wanted to do earlier, but we weren't going to because we were waiting to see how it would balance. And I think that was definitely the right call. Now it's paying off. We just had to have trust in the process, in ourselves, and that it would all work out as it has. Can add a little bit of a highlight on the bottom of the tree, a little bit of highlight to the edges of the grate here. And even add little highlights in the window to a small degree. I don't have much paint on my brush, very subtle. Let's grab some titanium white, a little bit of our cerulean blue. Have a little marking on the road, rectangular piece, but I'm going to make it look like it was poorly painted or that it was painted a long time ago. So it's a bit more rough around the edges, a little more visually unique. Something I do notice in the reference photo and I like it a lot. Again, benefits of working with a reference photo. I probably would have inherently just made this very full and sharp, but because I saw that, I knew, you know what? We don't have to paint it perfectly, and it'll probably look better if we don't. There we go. Little divot in the road, breaking it up too, I like that. We'll get a little bit more blue in the mixture as we move back with these. makes little details. We can also take that pigment and just create some little highlights, little wet areas of the road. Shouldn't overdo it, but it can be a nice little touch. Even splashes of it in the orange to a small degree. A lot of taps, but also horizontal markings. Speaking of which, we can grab our orange and do the exact same thing over here. Tap and drag, tap and drag, tap and drag. Little interjections into the blue side. Tap and drag. Need a nice sharp brush. This was the filbert that we made for the brush line. Something I really love about it is just how long the bristles are. I feel like I can grab a lot of water, a lot of paint, something you typically can't do with a liner, but it makes me being able to hold the brush farther away and make a lot of randomized taps much easier. And that's something I really appreciate in subjects like this, because it's so easy to kind of subconsciously fall into patterns which you don't want to do, because then it looks too visually samey. It looks a little boring. But by extending the bristles, we can just make this process easier. And if I haven't noted it yet, the brushes are finally on sale. We have an official set for the channel. You can find it in the video description. It is a 5-piece brush set. It is a brush set I am incredibly proud of. It is entirely vegan and cruelty-free, which was initially what really turned me on to working with the brand Craftimo to bring it to life. But in addition to that, all of the lessons that I've done over the last number of months have been done with the prototypes and now the final set. And I've loved the results. I've had this channel for about 8 years now, and I would always recommend different brands of paint because there were brands of paint that I really liked, but I could never recommend a brand of brushes because there wasn't one that I loved. And they said we could fully customize it, that I could include any brushes I wanted, that we could change the stiffness of the bristles, the length of them, that we could really just make it a brush set for the channel, so that all of the lessons that I did moving forward could be done with that brush set, so you could pick it up and you wouldn't have to guess on which brush I'm using or what you have is closest to it. We could always just paint with the exact same set of resources, right? So I loved that idea. We spent quite a few months working on it. It's finally out. It was an absolute pleasure to see so many people excited and picking them up. Saw all of those comments, and it just made me feel really good inside, to be honest. It was really, really wonderful. So here we are working with that brush set, and I am very happy with what we are getting done. Incorporating a little bit of splashed red just to make it slightly more unique. Not using the same orange all the way throughout. Now, I want to start adding some cars within here, but before we do, I want to finalize the back area of this road, and I know that I want it to be quite a bit brighter. So we're going to grab some titanium white, cerulean blue. Everything on my palette has fully dried, by the way. Took a little bit of a break, so we're coming back into it. We don't have to worry about that which we are mixing on top of, but I know I need a light blue, lighter than anything we currently have on the road, with the exception of maybe what we have right there. Now, I'm going to put this at the back of both, work it forward. I have a lot of pigment on my brush, so I'm going to take it off. Going to make my brush a little bit damp, so it's watery, great for blending wet and to dry. We'll move that forward here. Move it forward here. A couple little taps to space it out appropriately. Then I'm going to use my finger, do a little blend. You could do that blend with your brush, but I think I just want it to be a bit of a softer blend. I think that actually worked out really well. We'll apply a little bit more. Go in for that softer blend again. If you're using your finger though, do ensure that it is incredibly clean. You don't want the oils from your finger making it so that the canvas will not adopt paint. And that is a very real issue you can run into. So, finger painting is great, but we need to be careful with it. I think that actually looks quite lovely. Just brighten up those areas minorly. Work some horizontal strokes in there. You can even cover a little bit of the orange. Make it feel nice and cohesive. I like that a lot, actually. Feels really natural here. Okay, so now that we've established that as being a little bit brighter, we're going to take this brush, put it down for now, pick up our flat-headed, smaller brush, and for the vehicle, the first vehicle, we'll go with a darker blue as our base. So a lot of Mars black, a little bit of cerulean, a little bit of titanium white. It'd be quite close to the foreground, so it's one of those things that can have a pretty stark value. Covering up the open areas of white on our canvas, following perspective. Again, edges first, while we have the most water and easily applicable pigment. We're just painting a silhouette to begin with. Work in a wheel. Work in a second wheel. Third wheel. Won't see the fourth, so that's okay. Very stark at this point. We're going to make ones that are farther away a little bit brighter, so we'll interject some extra titanium white. And as they get farther away, you do want them to get less and less dark. So we just slowly interject more white into that mix. We can also change them to be different colored vehicles, but using this as a base value isn't a bad idea at all. I think I want the second one to be slightly darker. Not as dark as the one closest to us, but I want it to be slightly more distinct from that which is behind it. Just like that. We're going to have vehicles on the other side of the street. Just parked like that. Yet again, we make bright. And we'll add the actual color and details on top of these. There we go. Very subtle at this point. We've been purposefully attentive over here so that we can let this dry. And it's probably had enough time, so let's go in with a much brighter gray. Still using a hint of that blue. We'll get the top of the vehicle. We'll get the front. Brush is great for just cutting along these sharp edges. You can see it's coming along quite quickly. The door is open in the reference photo. I'm not going to do that because I don't want to overcomplicate this small image. There we go. Just lining up all of these little pieces. We'll have our lights in there. Let's get a much more blue mix for the windshield. And a little bit in the windows back there. Make it brighter, nice bright blue. Have it balance the road over there a little bit. I like that. We can even add hints of it into other portions of the vehicle just to make it fit. Something else we'll have to do is a little bit of a shadow on the ground. So we'll get some Mars black, some of our blue. Going to make this mixture a lot more watery because I want it to be semi-transparent. Do a little finger painting. It's going to block the light from the back, just on this side area here. Nice and easy. Again, not done, but we'll go back and incorporate the lights and some of the more obvious details a little bit later. Right now, we'll just throw on a little bit of extra highlight where we could use them. And it's one of those subjects where we don't want to finish it until we know what the rest of the piece looks like. So, heading over to the right-hand side, let's go with something similarly bright. Again, we're essentially just drawing the body of the car, the vehicle, grabbing the blue for the windshield. We'll make a different colored vehicle using some burnt sienna, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black. Work that in the back. We can apply this over here, maybe to another distant vehicle. Then let's make a red one. Really just jumping from color to color, but we're making them all fairly desaturated so that they don't stick out too much. But we do get that diversity. Essentially just painting in the hints of these vehicles, which is fun. Also, let's create a silhouette of a vehicle that's on this side of the road, right here. Brush doesn't have enough water to do so well. So rather than trying to force it, we go and we grab some water. Add another one in front, another one. Looking a little abstract right now, but it's okay. Still trying to be mindful of my hand in these situations. Really liked the burnt sienna, but let's mix it with a little bit of red this time. There we go. Just adding little details here and there. Now that we've given everything a little bit of time to dry, we're going to switch back to the liner, grab some of our cadmium yellow, about an equal mixture cadmium red, titanium white in abundance, and a little bit of that burnt sienna just to tone it down a little bit. You can see we have that nice warm but not too saturated orange. Great for working on the lights, which will be responsible for these. I also want to do a little bit of a glow to them, but I need to let it dry first. So we'll just do a little bit of a reflection on the metallic portions of the car that will catch it. We'll do reflect little lights in there, there. This is where it like very easily comes together with the vehicles. Just do a little inconsistent line coming down from here. Doesn't need to be big. Catch a little bit of highlight on this one from the one before. A little highlight on the back of this from that. A little highlight on the back of this from that. Like I said, this is far from done. We just needed to do everything else first so we could start finishing it. And of course we want our reflections from these. Working it inside the darker divots. Just like that. It's all coming together. And add some extra little lights in the back. Now let's go for a brighter variant of all of that. Taking some titanium white, we'll grab a little bit of this, work it into the titanium white. It's easier than trying to add the titanium white to this. Add a little bit more of that extra warmth. Build it up down here to a slightly greater degree. A little bit in here and here. There we go. A little bit of light. Reflecting. Really doesn't have to be perfect. I like the slight randomization a lot. Something else I really want to do, go back to the 1/2 inch flat. Go for a little bit of a darker mix, gray, hint of blue. Take the excess paint off, make sure it's nice and damp, again. We're going to start separating little blocks in here. Cutting back. Horizontally. Do that over here slightly. It's farther away so we won't really see to that same degree, but we can get a little bit of it. It's just a nice little added detail. I like that. Good. little bit of a shadow under this car. Via finger painting, of course. Now, I do also want to add some little street lights. Mars Black, Cerulean Blue, Titanium White, very dark mix. Want to do one right here. So we have our little pole. Another one right here. Just using our little sharp brush. Again, apologies if my hand's in the way. It's really awkward angle. I want to do another one right here. Need more water though. Means our layer will be thinner, but it will be sharper. You can always go back and just do another layer. There we go. So we have 1, 2, 3. Do we want to add them to the other side? I might add 1, 2. Not in a grand abundance. There we go. Clean that brush off. We're still yet to use the fan brush for the real detail work, and that will be fun, but that is coming soon. For now, we're going back to our nice warm highlight with the liner. We're adding a little bit of warmth to the upper portions of the painting. Goes up to about here, following that line. Now, typically I'd wait for that to dry to do the highlight, but I don't think we really have to. We'll just go in with an abundance of paint, work that into the center. Maybe do a couple more just in the back. Do a little highlight going down. Giving it a bit more of a definitive shape. We also haven't done the glow for them yet. That'll be fun. But now we are going to switch to our smaller flat to do some mixing. Orange. And a fairly subtle orange. Don't want it to be too bright, but I don't want it to be too saturated, so we're going to use a lot more of our burnt sienna than we typically do, and I'm mixing an abundance of it, as you can see. Actually, we're also not using much of our yellow, so I can probably also incorporate a small bit of black just to desaturate it. Don't really need to darken it too much more, and in fact we'll brighten it just a little bit with our titanium white, and this is great. This is just what I wanted. Now I'm going to take this brush, clean it well because it has an abundance of paint and we don't want it drying on our brush. We'll switch to the fan brush, not making it damp. And this fan brush is quite unique in that it's a stiff bristled fan brush, but it's not hyper stiff, so if you want, you can wet it and it'll condense the bristles, so you'll have 5 or 6 little pieces. So it can act as a soft bristled fan brush if you want, but it can also act as a stiff bristled fan brush, so you don't have to use 2, like I always used to go back and forth with in the lessons. And with this one, we're just going to be tapping on all of these little subtle reflections in the foreground. And you can see that I'm rotating my brush a little bit. I'm also not pressing in with the entirety of the brush. I just want small portions, and I want this randomized, beautiful highlight on the road. Essentially for all of the little pieces of the road that protrude and then catch a little bit of light because of the water. But it's a really easy way of getting in so much more detail. Let's make this mix a little bit brighter, a little bit more saturated. And we'll just build. That brush still has quite a bit of paint on it, but we'll deal with that in a second. Here, again, tapping on those highlights, predominantly emanating from the true highlights in the middle here. Little rotations, trying to not get actual lines, but just a random splattering of light within that area. We can even tap some onto the side here. We can tap some into here, a little bit into the reflective light. Give it a bit of magic. I love that. I think that adds so much to it. That said, I do now need to clean this, so I'm going to put it in water, which will condense my bristles, and I'll show you what they look like. See? Now condensed. So now if we were to use this to make those taps, we'd only get significantly less of them, which is not what we want right now, so we'll have to dry that to do it again, but I do need to clean this brush as well. Painting isn't just about applying paint to the brush, it's also about taking it off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and dry my brush as well, then we'll come back and we'll continue with the fan brush technique. So we are back with clean brushes and dry brushes, though I am going to make the smaller flathead a little bit damp. We'll grab our Cerulean blue, titanium white, a clean portion that doesn't have orange in it, a little bit of our Mars black. Mix that up into a somewhat desaturated blue, not as bright as everything we have there, but still relatively bright. And again, it's all relative in these paintings, right? It's all about what's beside it. Now we'll grab our dry fan brush, grab some of that pigment, tap on some really nice reflective pieces. This is something that we can only really achieve with the fan brush because we're pressing into the canvas with individual bristles, something that we can't do with even the liner. It also gives us an element of randomization, which I really appreciate. And if you do too much, it's very easy to work back because the road is such an interesting amalgamation of strokes anyway. Trying to dodge the little crevices for the most part, but I like that a lot. And speaking of working a little bit more reductively, first of all, making sure this is nice and clean. We are not going to use it for a good minute. I'm also going to make sure my smaller flathead is quite a bit cleaner because it too is going to be used later. We are switching to the larger flat-headed brush. Haven't used this in a little while. Making it nice and damp. We're going to grab some Mars black, a little bit of our Cerulean blue, a lot of water, and we're essentially making another glaze. And with this, I'm going to go to the corner of this painting. I do need a little bit more water. You can already tell. I'm going to make this corner a little bit darker. A little bit of a finger blend. Again, you could use your brush. It's really whatever you're most comfortable with. I just want to ensure that the edges of the painting as a whole are a bit darker. That way we have that nice vignette effect. The eyes will innately go to the brightest point of any piece, so typically we want that brightest point to be a bit more center oriented. Here I'll do a little bit of a tapped blend. I think that worked quite nice. We can also go back to our liner, grab some of the beautiful oranges, just like that, and then do small reincorporations over the darker pigment. So now we have the street, we have the first layer of light, we have the fan brush incorporated light, we have the darker glaze, and now we have additional light and applications. That's why these take so long to start to look nice. It's a lot of layering. It's a lot of trusting the process. That's something you really learn well when you paint. You get that patience, that faith, and then you make beautiful things. You might say it's character building. There we go. Bit more orange, I like it. Still need to do the glows. I think we'll do that next. Okay, so let's start adding some glows to this. They're going to be a bit more yellow dominant of an orange, but we are still going to use some red, and we are still going to use a little bit of titanium white. We don't want too much titanium white in this mix because titanium white will really thicken the pigment, and we want it to be semi-transparent for the most part, but we also don't want it to be hyper-saturated. So the titanium white will help us with that. A Naples yellow is also a great pigment to kind of work in instead of that, but Naples yellow is also a bit more thick. That said, we're going to make it quite watery. We're going to go to areas that have a lot of light. And then again, you have the choice of blending it out with your brush or your hand or both. Where it's really going to shine is up in the lights because you have those darker trees as backdrops. There's one. There's one. It makes it a little bit less visually sharp, but it gives the painting some nice warmth, which is great considering we have all of the cool blues, and it is a bit of a rainy piece. So we're just adding a little bit of that shine. Some areas you will get a green when you work this over it. That's okay. Also just going to use it to brighten up some of our highlights throughout the painting. Interject a little bit more yellow. You can build this up over multiple layers. Because it's so watery, you can only add so much at a time. But you can continuously go back and build on it, which is nice. That said, I do want a much brighter pigment variant of it. So a lot of titanium white. This is quite thick now. I'm going to use this at the heart of some of the more important lights. Doing what we just did will desaturate, and it'll also mute them a little bit. So I like to go back and re-heighten them. So we're just throwing a little bit of extra highlight into these. and some of the reflections. Also, we are getting towards the end, so I would like to say a big thank you to everybody who has made it this far. Typically, statistically, 13% of people make it to the very end of the lesson. So if you are one of those 13%, congratulations to you. You are one of the dedicated few who is truly invested in what we are doing here today, and I think because of that, you are going to get the best results. I love when people are willing to put in the time and the effort to really learn things. I think it makes a big difference, and I just want to congratulate you on being that type of person here today. I think it will show through in your work, not just this, but the rest of what you do in life. You know, that's a character quality that I very much respect. Also, as per usual, as we get towards the end, I'd like to give you a little keyword, something you can use in the comments to note that you were one of those few who made it here, and it's a little essentially subtle badge of honor that only those of us who make it to the end do get to know about. Just going to add a little bit of light down that. A little bit of light down this one too. There we go. But as for our keyword, I think today we'll go with reflection, because it's something you can either just type in the comments or incorporate into a comment very easily, and it won't be a super noticeable word, you know? I always find it really fun to see how people work those in and who continuously does make it to the end of these. Also, as per usual, I would like to say a massive, massive thank you to everybody who is up over on Patreon, directly supporting the channel, making lessons like this happen. This channel is predominantly community funded by amazing people like yourself, and without you, I would not be able to put the time into making these. So, big, big, big thank you for doing that the way that you do. If you're new to the channel, up over on Patreon, you can find the traceable, so a little digital sketch of this that you can transfer using either transfer paper or using the grid and sketching it, or using something like a miniature projector. There are a lot of different avenues of going about that, but those are options. Up there, you can also get the list of materials with a photo, so you can see all of the individual tubes of paint that I opted to use for this, as well as the paint brushes. The paint brushes are also all from my new set, so you can find those in the description as well. But up on Patreon, you can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. There's also a bunch of ebooks full of traceables. You can also get access to our exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions of these pieces. It's an incredibly inspiring community, very helpful, very supportive. It's something I'm incredibly proud of, to be honest. I love popping in there and seeing what everybody's up to. Always very inspiring, and often I will go there and somebody will post their own reference photos or their own piece that they came up with, and I will find myself very inspired to go out and paint and make something similar, or it's just a really, really cool collection of people and work. So, Facebook group, traceables, all of the behind the scenes photos. You can get the reference photos, ebooks. There are a bunch of bonus lessons. A bunch of fun stuff up there if you're interested. It's also just a great way to support the channel. But no worries if you cannot. I just appreciate you being here, being a part of the community. Painting along, leaving comments. Just get a little bit more yellow. want a bit more orange, but not too saturated or too bright. That should do it. Just to work over a little bit of these divots in the road that I reincorporated. Not fully work them over, but a little bit here and there. There we go. With that, I would like to say a big thank you to you for being here, taking the time. I wish you an incredibly successful painting. Hope you have a wonderful time doing it. I hope you feel like you've learned something. And I hope you feel inspired to go out and make something that makes you genuinely really happy. I think this is a pretty wonderful way to spend a day. And I wish you a great deal of joy. With that, above all, as always, stay creative.